You do it without thinking. You wake up, and before you even feel the weight of your own body, before you notice the light coming through the window, before you take a single conscious breath, you check the time. Maybe it's your phone. Maybe it's a clock on the wall. Maybe it's the first number that enters your mind each morning, and then something shifts. Something tightens. The day has already begun, and you're already behind. We all know this feeling, my friends. It is one of the most common human experiences on Earth right now. And yet, almost none of us stop to ask the question that truly matters. When did time stop being something we lived inside and become something that controls us? For most of human history, time was not something you measured. It was something you felt. You woke when the sky grew light. You ate when you were hungry. You rested when your body told you to rest. The rhythms of your life were tied to something much larger than any number. The movement of the sun across the sky, the slow turn of the seasons, the sound of rain arriving after weeks of dry heat. Time was not a line moving forward. It was a circle, repeating, breathing, alive. Early civilizations did develop ways to track time, of course. The ancient Egyptians divided the day using shadow clocks, simple devices that measured the movement of sunlight across the ground. The Mesopotamians, thousands of years before the modern world, gave us the idea of dividing the day into 24 hours. And across many cultures, water clocks were used to measure the passing of time with quiet, steady drops falling from one vessel into another. These were tools of observation. They helped people notice time, when to plant crops, when to prepare for winter, when religious ceremonies should begin. But here is what is important to understand, my friends. These early instruments did not command people. They informed them. There is a profound difference between those two things. A farmer watching the position of the sun did not feel that the sun was judging him. He was not late. He was not behind. He was simply reading the world around him the way he had always done, the way his father had done, and his father before that. Time was a natural force, like wind or water. It existed outside of human control, and people accepted that with a kind of quiet humility. Even in the ancient world, different cultures experienced time differently. Many indigenous traditions across Asia, Africa, and the Americas understood time as cyclical, not something that ran out, but something that ran out. The idea that time was linear, that it moved in one direction only and could be lost, was not a universal human belief. It was, in many ways, a cultural invention. Think about what that means for a moment. The anxiety you feel when you are running late, the pressure you feel when a deadline approaches, the guilt you feel when a day passes and you have not been productive. None of that is written into human nature. It was learned. It was built. And it was built, like most powerful systems, so gradually that almost no one noticed it happening. The world in which time was felt rather than measured was not a perfect world. Life was harder in many ways, more uncertain, more vulnerable to nature's cruelty. But in one specific sense, people lived with a freedom that is almost impossible to imagine today. The freedom to exist inside a moment, without a number telling them that the moment had already passed. That world did not disappear overnight. Something had to change it. And that change began not in a factory, not in a city, but in the quiet stone corridors of a monastery. The first mechanical clocks in Europe did not appear in town squares or government buildings. They appeared in monasteries, and they were built for a very specific purpose. Medieval monks lived by a strict daily schedule of prayer. 7 times a day, from before dawn until after dark, they were required to stop whatever they were doing and worship. Missing a prayer was not simply inconvenient. It was, in their belief, a failure before God. And so the monasteries needed something reliable, something that did not depend on the weather or the season or a tired human eye watching the shadow move across stone. They needed a machine. By the 13th and 14th centuries, mechanical clocks driven by weights and gears began to appear across Europe. They were imprecise by modern standards. Some lost or gained hours each day, but they were consistent enough to organize communal life around a shared rhythm. For the first time, a community of people was synchronizing their behavior not to nature, but to a machine. This was a small change with enormous consequences. When clocks moved from monastery walls to city towers, something fundamental shifted. Merchants began using them to structure business hours. Employers began measuring the working day not by the task completed, but by the time spent. And here lies the moment, my friends, when time quietly changed its nature. From a background condition of life into a resource that could be owned, sold, and wasted. The Industrial Revolution accelerated this transformation with extraordinary force. Factories required hundreds of workers to arrive, work, and leave at precisely the same moment. A worker who arrived late did not simply inconvenience himself, he disrupted an entire system. And so punctuality became not just a courtesy, but a moral virtue. To be on time was to be responsible. To be late was to be a problem. By the 19th century, the standardization of time had gone even further. When railways began connecting cities across countries, each town could no longer keep its own local time. A train could not run on a schedule if every station operated in a different time zone. In 1884, an international conference established the global system of standard time zones we still use today. The entire planet was divided into measured segments, each one locked to a single shared clock. Think about what an ordinary factory worker in 1880 might have experienced. His grandfather had worked the land, waking with the sun and resting when the light failed. But this man woke to an alarm, walked to a building where a bell controlled every movement of his day, and returned home exhausted, not from physical labor alone, but from the constant pressure for forming his life on schedule. He probably did not think of himself as a slave to time. He thought of himself as a modern man, living in a modern world. And that, perhaps, is what made the system so effective. It did not feel like a cage. It felt like progress. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you have done. You know it, my friends. It is the tiredness that arrives not at the end of a long physical effort, but at the end of a day where you moved from one scheduled moment to the next, never quite catching your breath, never quite feeling present in any of them. You were there, in the meeting, at the dinner, during the conversation, but some part of you was already calculating what came next, how much time remained, whether you were moving fast enough. This is the hidden cost that no one talks about when they celebrate human progress and productivity. The clock did not just organize our days. Over time, it quietly reorganized our inner lives. Before mechanical time took hold, human beings experienced what researchers and philosophers now call felt time, the subjective, elastic quality of a moment. Time moved slowly during boredom and grief. It accelerated during joy and deep focus. A single afternoon could feel like a lifetime if it was filled with meaning. This was not confusion or imprecision. It was the natural way a conscious mind experiences existence. But the clock teaches a different lesson. It teaches that all hours are equal, that a Tuesday morning is worth exactly as much as a Sunday evening, that the hour you spent staring at the sea and thinking of nothing has the same numerical value as the hour you spent in a productive meeting. And because the clock measures everything equally, we slowly began to judge our hours equally, asking, not how did that feel, but what did I accomplish? Consider the experience of a mother sitting with her young child on a quiet afternoon. The child is drawing. Nothing urgent is happening. By every clock-based measurement, this hour is unproductive, and yet something deep and irreplaceable is occurring. A connection, a memory forming, a kind of nourishment that cannot be scheduled. But the mother feels it too, doesn't she? That low hum of guilt, the sense that she should be doing something, that time is passing and she is not filling it correctly. That guilt was not always there. It was installed, and the cost goes deeper still. When we lose the ability to live inside felt time, we also lose our connection to our own bodies. We eat not when we are hungry, but when the clock says it is mealtime. We sleep not when we are tired, but when the hour finally permits it. We push through exhaustion because the schedule demands it, and we lie awake when we should be resting because the mind, trained to measure and manage, cannot simply stop. The body has its own intelligence, its own ancient rhythms shaped over thousands of years of human life. The clock does not negotiate with those rhythms. It overrides them. And perhaps the most painful part of all this is how invisible it becomes. We stop noticing the tension because the tension is always there. We stop questioning the schedule because the schedule is simply reality. The cage disappears when you forget there was ever anything outside it. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. For most of human history, if you wanted to escape the pressure of time, you could. You could walk into a forest. You could sit beside a river. You could enter a space where no clock existed, and for a while the world would loosen its grip. The pressure was real, but it had edges. There were places it could not follow you. That world is almost entirely gone now. Today the average person checks their phone over 80 times a day, not always for a reason, often simply out of habit, out of reflex, out of a low-level anxiety that something important might be happening without them. And on that phone, always visible, always present, is the time. Not a clock on a wall you might choose to ignore. A number that travels with you everywhere, that wakes with you and sleeps beside you. That is the first thing you see and the last. The digital age did not invent the tyranny of time, but it completed it. What changed was not just the presence of clocks, but the architecture of modern life that grew around them. Calendars that fill months in advance, notifications that arrive at precise intervals, productivity systems that break the day into optimized blocks, each one assigned a purpose, a goal, a measurable outcome. Even rest has been scheduled now. There are apps that tell you exactly when to sleep, for how long, and what quality of rest you achieved. We have found a way to measure even the hours when we are unconscious. And underneath all of this technology runs a cultural current that is perhaps more powerful than any device, the belief that busyness is a virtue. Somewhere in the last century, being busy became something to be proud of. Ask almost anyone how they are, and the answer comes quickly. Busy, so busy, incredibly busy. It is said with exhaustion, yes, but also with a kind of quiet pride, because in a world built around the clock, the person who fills every hour is the person who is doing life correctly. The person who moves slowly, who pauses, who allows empty time to exist, that person is falling behind. Think of how a young professional today might describe their ideal week. Every morning optimized, every commute used for learning, every lunch break treated as an opportunity. Even their weekends are structured around self-improvement, social obligations, and recovery, which is itself scheduled, timed, and tracked. There is nothing wrong with ambition or with caring how you spend your days. But there is a difference between choosing how to use your time and feeling that every moment must be justified. One comes from freedom. The other comes from fear. And when an entire society organizes itself around that fear, when rest feels like failure and stillness feels like waste, something essential about human life begins to erode. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, the way water wears down stone. We build the clock to serve us. And then, without quite deciding to, we began to serve it. There is an old question that philosophers have returned to across many centuries, in many different languages, in many different cultures. It is not a complicated question, but it is one of the most honest questions a human being can ask. What is time, really? Not the number on your phone. Not the division of the day into hours and minutes. Not the deadline, the schedule, the alarm. Beneath all of that, beneath the entire system we have built and inherited and forgotten to question, what is time at its deepest level? The physicist will tell you that time is a dimension, woven into the fabric of the universe, inseparable from space itself. The philosopher will tell you that time may exist only in the mind, that the past is memory, the future is imagination, and only the present is real. The poet will tell you that time is the distance between who you were and who you are becoming. None of these answers fit neatly into a calendar. My friends, I am not suggesting that we abandon clocks. The world we live in is interconnected in ways that require coordination, and coordination requires a shared sense of time. Trains must arrive. Surgeries must begin. People who love each other must find the same moment to be in the same place. These things matter, and clocks serve them well. But there is a difference between using time and being consumed by it, and that difference is one of the most important things a person can learn to feel. When you sit with someone you love, and the conversation drifts and the evening grows late and neither of you has looked at a clock, you are not wasting time. You are doing something that the entire architecture of modern life quietly works against. You are living in felt time. You are letting a moment be what it is, without measuring it, without asking what it is worth. When you walk somewhere slowly, noticing small things, the color of a wall, the sound of rain on leaves, the way light changes as a cloud moves, you are not being unproductive. You are recovering a way of being that your body and mind were shaped for over thousands of years of human evolution. The ancient Egyptians had a concept worth remembering. Alongside their careful measurements of the day, they also understood kairos. Not the Greeks used this word, but the idea existed across many traditions. The sense of the right moment, the qualitative experience of time, time that is full rather than simply long. Not how many hours passed, but whether the hours meant something. Perhaps wisdom, in this context, is not about managing time better. Perhaps it is about remembering that you are not a machine to be optimized, that your life is not a resource to be spent efficiently, that some of the most important things that will ever happen to you will happen in moments that no productivity system would have scheduled. The clock is a tool. A powerful one, yes, one that shaped civilizations, built industries, connected the world, but a tool nonetheless. And tools are meant to serve the person who holds them, not the other way around. You do not have to escape the clock entirely, but you might, just occasionally, choose to set it down, to let a morning move at its own pace, to finish a meal without checking the time, to sit in the quiet for a few minutes and remember that you existed before the schedule and you exist between the numbers and the breathing spaces that no alarm can reach. That is where you actually live, my friends, not in the minutes, in the moments. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.